Okay, and so we're live. Could you two first just say who you are and then kind of summarize from your point of view what happened today?
Sure. My name is Gibbons. I'm Policy and Legislative Counsel for the Defending Rights and Dissent. It's a group that protects the right to political expression. I also, as a journalist, have covered this case in Jacobin and The Nation. Today, the prosecution and defense gave their opening arguments in which they presented their cases in chief. The prosecution's argument was particularly weak. She kept talking about there was a riot and mentioning property damage, but she never really tied any of it to any of the individual defendants. In fact, at one point she said, I freely concede that, you know, we have no evidence that any of these 6 people did personally property damage. And I thought that the defense, by showing actual videos of what was clearly a march, what really made the point that these people were involved in First Amendment protected activity and that this trial is guilt by association.
My name is Kris Hermes. I am a legal worker and longtime activist and author and a member of the National Lawyers Guild. I've been working with defendants and supporters for many months now as part of Defend J20 Resistance. I was in court all day today hearing opening statements from both the prosecution and the defense. I agree with Chip's analysis that the prosecution seems to have a very weak case against these 6 defendants as being part of a conspiracy or rioting or inciting a riot, and certainly not guilty of any property destruction. We also heard from the manager at Au Bon Pain and a police officer that was on a bicycle or part of a bike squad along the protest route. I would say, if anything so far, this case is about sending a message to would-be protesters that the Trump administration is unwilling to tolerate militant resistance and political opposition. The fact that these defendants are being prosecuted by the Trump administration is not lost on them as political opponents to Donald Trump, and specifically here on the streets to protest his inauguration. And we look forward to hearing more testimony and pushing back on any claims or allegations that these defendants did anything wrong.
So we had kind of a variety of people. It was basically 1 journalist, 2 street medics, and then sort of some others. Can you kind of summarize sort of who are the people who are actually on trial now, and how do they connect to or not connect to what we actually saw?
Well, we have 1 photojournalist. We have 2 defendants who are being named by the prosecution as medics, and we have 3 people who are alleged to be protesters. The prosecution really doesn't have anything on them, and I think the accusations that because medics were at the protest, therefore there was this expectation of violence and destruction is ridiculous. We had dozens and dozens of medics deployed throughout the weekend, including the Women's March. Because police are known, unfortunately, in the United States of attacking protesters violently, there's a need for medics at these demonstrations, and that's why they're there, because of a historic problem with police violence at mass demonstrations.
The case against the medics was really weird to me because the prosecution kept mentioning medics as though they were nefarious throughout her opening argument. And when I hear medic, I think of a positive thing, as I do. She made the comment that this is not your first aid tech at a charity block. That was verbatim what she said. It was just really weird, like trying to turn medics into a sinister, nefarious element. I'm questioning how the jury interpreted that, but it just struck me as a really misfire on her part.
Yeah, and as a member of the National Lawyers Guild, the prosecution has also gone after NLG legal observers who are deployed in mass demonstration situations to monitor police behavior and specifically police misconduct. So to say that legal observers were there because violence or property destruction was planned is also erroneous and really slanderous, since National Lawyers Guild legal observers are on the streets to make sure that police are not violating people's rights and the law.
I mean, and the impact of that, if this theory was to hold, that if you have legal observers, if you have medics, that makes you somehow, guilty of planning a riot, that'd be really corrosive, because it would mean basically if you prepare responsibly for a demonstration, you're more likely than if you hadn't to be criminally charged.
Yeah.
If that logic was to hold up, that would be really dangerous.
I want to also recognize a thread that occurred throughout not only the prosecution's opening statements, but also in the questioning of witnesses. This notion, sorry, lost my train. Yeah, sorry.
I was going to ask about what do you think are kind of the effects of the fact that we have a journalist? The only person I ever saw on video who was actually sitting at that table that we know of is Alexei, who, and I may have pronounced his name wrong, but Alexei, who was seen on camera holding in one camera, in one hand a camera, and in the other a camera phone, right? And those were the two things he was kind of wielding in the one moment he was seen. What are kind of the implications of prosecuting a journalist in this case? So
Defending Rights and Dissent, along with PEN America, the Freedom of Press Foundation, Free Press, the Nation Institute, and Roots Action, and other people I'm probably forgetting, all sent a letter to the prosecutor arguing that the prosecution of Alexei Wood and Aaron Cantu, who's also a journalist who's on trial today, threatens press freedom. I mean, the entire case is based on guilt by association. So if you're at a protest protesting, you're guilty of rioting, and the prosecution actually takes that one step further. If you're a journalist covering a protest where there happens to be some vandalism, you're now guilty of rioting. So this case is not only the criminalization of protest, it's the criminalization of journalism. That's a huge, huge threat. Because one thing about journalists is they're a check on police brutality. And we saw plenty of that during the inauguration. But if they think if they come and do critical adversarial journalism, they could end up in jail for 60 years, we're going to lose that check on the police.
In Leibovitz, the judge also seems to have misunderstood the First Amendment. In a pretrial hearing, she indicated that Alexei Wood, or at least implied that he wouldn't be covered under the First Amendment because he expressed a particular biased opinion about what was going on around him, and that is not objective enough to qualify as a legitimate journalist, which is ridiculous.
That's a theory that's been rejected by their courts. I mean, when Amy Goodman was charged with felony rioting at Standing Rock for covering the protests there, the prosecution made that exact same argument, and the judge told them, no, that's viewpoint and content discrimination, and that is flagrantly something you're not allowed to do under the like that is like the one thing you're not supposed to do under the First Amendment is viewpoint discrimination. So that I did not know she had made that argument. That's really very shocking. So that is not a correct application of the law.
And of course, the First Amendment's not just freedom of speech; that's an important part of it. But there's assembly and
association.
And association. Can you talk about kind of, with the exception of religion, it seems like it addressed almost every part of the First Amendment. Can you talk about kind of the parts of the First Amendment and how they came into play today? I heard references to almost all of them.
Sure. I mean, the association element is that these people know people who are anarchists and who allegedly committed, these crimes. I mean, that's very blatantly a criminalization of freedom of association. I'm allowed to associate with a group of people all wearing black if I want to. The First Amendment gives me that right. If one of those people then does, I don't know why I'm pointing at you, Kris. If one of them does something unlawful, not Kris, of course, I don't then go to jail because of that. That's a blatant criminalization of my right to association. Assembly, I think, is quite obvious. Why it's a threat to this, but do you want to?
Well, I don't have anything necessarily to add in that vein, but I did want to follow up again on the prosecution's sort of thread and an attempt to show how the police were restrained by talking about how in an area of alleged tumultuousness, that the police didn't draw their weapons in order to try and de-escalate the situation or stop them from marching or destroying more property. The notion that it would be acceptable to draw your gun in a situation like that is ridiculous. So it sets a bar that is unacceptable for showing police restraint. In other words, everything they did, the chemical weapons, the projectile weapons, is all, according to the prosecution, acceptable because at least they didn't draw their gun.
Right. And were you there on J20, by the way?
I was not.
Okay. For someone in the audience has kind of asked in the comments here, how should the court understand what the line is of journalism to, not journalism, so to speak? How should the judge make that determination?
Well, we're in a new era here where many journalists are independent, not working for a large mainstream media outlet, and we have to, in some sense, potentially be careful not to be too restrictive and push out people who may be considered independent journalists. So happens that two people being prosecuted in these cases, one who's on trial right now, one who's yet to go to trial, fit in that category. And so if you're a blogger, I would define that as a journalist. If you are taking photographs or video footage or live streaming at a demonstration, I think that should be considered journalism. And so the category tends to increase, at least around the definition of journalism. But again, the rights that are afforded to journalists fall under a very large umbrella that also protect protesters in the streets.
And so can you just kind of give me a projection of what can we sort of expect? It sounds like it's going to be a year of rounds of this, and this was basically the first day of it. What's kind of the structure of what's coming up?
So the judge decided to break up the 194 defendants into trial groups of approximately 8 or 9 people each. And so there will be more than 20 trials that take place over approximately a year time. And we'll see how the prosecution decides to proceed after the first couple of trials, which occur, well, the one that's occurring now, there's another one starting December 11th, and then not another set until March, but they're supposed to go till roughly October in more than 20 trial groups. So it's a huge feat for the prosecution to try this many people in this way. It's unclear whether it will play out like that in the end, but that's what we're up against.
And lastly, what are kind of the wider implications of this trial, whether or not they're found guilty, the fact that this trial is happening, and then what would be the implications of the results?
Well, we're already in the midst of the implications of the charges, the indictment, which came down in April, the superseding indictment, which leveled 8 felony charges against each defendant. 2 of those charges have been dropped to misdemeanors, but they're still facing more than 60 years in prison. So for these folks who are standing trial, the implications are pretty grave that if they are convicted on all counts, they face a maximum sentence of more than 60 years in prison. The implications for the greater population in this country, in the United States, is that you better watch out if you choose to go to a protest, a mass demonstration, wherever you might be or live. You could suffer the consequences of felony charges and having to go to trial like these folks are. And that has a chilling effect on free speech that is difficult to really define, but I can say that it has very serious implications for the First Amendment in this country.
So I know I said lastly, but I have sort of one more based on some commenters seem to be sort of sympathetic, and some commenters are saying things like, well, they shouldn't have been there, they should have known that there'd be violence and all this kind of stuff. To somebody who might be a pro-Trump type person, somebody who might not understand this case or might for some reason be against the defendants in this case, what would you want that type of person to know if they're watching right now?
Yeah, I think this was a more militant expression of resistance than you saw at other points of the weekend, but that doesn't make it any less legitimate. And The fact that people came together all dressed in black and are angry about the condition of this country and the election of Donald Trump doesn't mean that they shouldn't be allowed to express themselves. The fact that people were breaking windows nearby doesn't make them guilty by association. Those people should still be able to protest and not have to deal with the consequences of several felony charges.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Yeah, thanks for it.